Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. Fiona Warren is a research consultant, writer, trainer and coach. She worked for 10 years as a researcher with the South West London and St George's Mental Health Trust, based at St George's Hospital and the Henderson Hospital. In 2005, Fiona took up a post as lecturer in psychology and eventually research director at the University of Surrey. Fiona was deeply involved with the Henderson Hospital, which was the inspirational treatment facility for people with personality disorders, and which was closed, ostensibly for financial reasons, in 2008.
Fiona, really good to have you on the show today. Could you briefly tell us something about yourself and your career and how your career pathway's gone?
Yes, I should probably just say, just sort of for completeness, that when you say I was research director at the University of Surrey, it was just for the clinical psychology programme in the Department of Psychology, so not for the whole university. My career path. So, yeah, well, as you say, I started out really my career in the Henderson. I did a few jobs before that, getting experience, thinking that I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. So I worked in some acute psychiatric settings and that kind of thing. And then really, I did a lot of my growing up at the Henderson. So I joined there in 94, I think, and was then under the supervision of the brilliant Bridget Dolan, who subsequently moved on to pursue another career in law and is now a QC. But I mean, she was a really very inspirational character and really drove a lot of the research that went on at the Henderson, and I followed on very much from that. After about 10 years there, then yes, I went on to the University of Surrey and started teaching on the clinical psychology programme, but carried on doing research in personality disorders and related aspects of mental health work. I left there, so I think it's a poor connection, but I left there in and then pursued, well, I took a break, and now I've retrained as a coach and do research consultancy and writing, as you said, David, in your introduction.
Thank you. And I suppose I'm struck by the fact that you gravitated towards working with people with personality disorder at a time when they were viewed as quite a difficult client group to work with. A lot, there's an awful lot of research on the fact that people who met diagnostic criteria for personality disorder were avoided by a lot of mental health professionals. I'm curious about what attracted you to work in a setting where you knew that would be your patient group.
Well, I think that's a great reminder to actually one of the motivations for me, because obviously when I joined, I didn't really know that because I was very young and just starting out in psychology. But I was very motivated by the fact that these were the sick note patients that psychiatrists dislike. That paper had just come out then. And obviously the Henderson was perhaps, filling a very niche and difficult area, and trying very hard to educate more widely as well as inspecting itself and doing its daily treatment. So yeah, I think I did have a passionate commitment to the idea that this patient group was one that were avoided, often misdiagnosed, going through a sort of revolving door process with increasing levels of distress, really. So yeah, and at that time, lots was going on in the field. It was busy, and things were moving quickly, and so that was interesting and captivating to me. And as I say, Bridget was very inspirational, so she was a good leader to have as well.
And how did you manage your research independence with your engagement in the day-to-day activities while you were there?
Well, that's a great question, and one that always needs to be asked. So I didn't have a clinical role at the Henderson. I was immersed in the sense of I would attend some community meetings to be accountable for the research function. I was able to offer, points about other things that were going on, but I didn't have a therapeutic role. So I didn't run groups or anything like that. And in terms of the sort of practicalities of managing the research independence, I did some qualitative work there, which obviously I couldn't be blind to the people that I was seeing and their experiences and what they were saying about the treatment, but I was bound by confidentiality of the researcher. But all the quantitative data we collected was anonymous. So any questionnaires or results that we got from other places about treatment use. So we also sent research questionnaires to referrers and GPs, for example. I didn't know who those people were. Followed, pretty good research practices in that sense. So I would say those were the primary ways that I protected that. It was, not an easy balance to strike, I guess, but you wanted to be familiar to the residents as well, and not a kind of aloof function that was inspecting them and would alienate them. So that was a balance that we tried to strike.
I know when we were involved in a 4-site research project, and so an assessment of patients across the 4 sites that were previously called dangerous and severe personality disorder sites, and it seemed better to have the researchers based in the unit in order to build up some familiarity with the patients to be able to overcome their barriers to engaging with the task. So it's quite a tricky path to walk, I think, isn't it? Being close enough to not be viewed with suspicion and paranoia, but not so close that it would appear that you'd got a vested interest in the outcome.
Yeah, which could create demand in them. Their responses might be altered by what they expect that you expect, but also perhaps in your behaviour too. I agree, but you can only do your best to do that and follow up.
Well, I was also curious about the fact that you'd engaged with qualitative research at that point as well, because actually at that time that wasn't so well established as a form of inquiry, was it? There was a lot more emphasis on doing quantitative studies. So it's interesting that you chose to use that approach, and I suppose that makes me wonder whether you like a challenge, in terms of the challenge of a patient group that are not seen as being easy to engage, and then a research methodology that wasn't as accepted and established as it is now.
Well, I suppose I must be a sucker for punishment in some way. I guess so. I mean, at the time when I was originally employed, I was employed to work on the outcome study, which was primarily quantitative collection of data around service usage, psychological symptomatology. And that was a long-running study. So we've actually followed people up for 10 years. And within that, I wanted to explore a bit more about what it was about being there that the residents thought influenced them in terms of positive change. And I particularly was interested in self-harm, because it seemed that the residents' practices of self-harm did change over time and did improve, so that some of the quantitative data was suggesting there was an improvement, particularly in self-destructive behaviours. And, at the time, that client group was very much seen as having a constellation of impulsivity issues around self-harming, gambling, drink, those kind of factors, as well as perhaps interpersonal violence. So I was particularly interested in trying to find out from the patient group, from the residents, what they thought was going on, hence doing some interviews with them over time. And I really enjoyed it. But you're right, it was a challenge to convince various people that it was an activity worth doing. And at that time, sort of the idea of mixed methods was emerging, and that was quite controversial. Was that breaching some sort of epistemological boundary? Is it really ever possible to do mixed methods? So yeah, I had to wrestle with that a little bit too.
And I think, just looking back, things have changed a lot, haven't they, in terms of people's understanding of personality disorder, so that now it's much more common for people to think about it as an adaptive response to childhood adversity and trauma. I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts on how that might have shaped up research differently if it had been conceptualised in that way at the time when you were doing your research.
I'm sure that deserves a proper, well thought out response, because would it have influenced the research? I think it might have influenced the reception that research got. I suppose actually if there was a more sympathetic environment, research might have concentrated more on understanding than looking at behavioural outcomes that showed effectiveness. But perhaps not, because you still needed to look at how improvement was possible and how best to meet the needs of this group.
Thank you. And you did some research on the cost effectiveness of the Henderson Hospital, which I think is often the thing that people are most interested in. And I wondered what that showed.
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it, that people are, if it's true still, that people are often most interested in that. And that research was done at the end of the 90s, I think. And actually the first paper was done by Diana Mingies. And then Bridget and I did some further work on it. But that showed that, the methodology. So this time, again, talking about research practices, health economics was not well established. Few units had researchers anyway. Research and audit wasn't embedded in health services like it is now. So actually the methodology for this was quite simple, but it was one of the better methodologies around at the time. So it was only a group of 24 patients, 24 residents, and we looked for information from services about service use. We looked at average bed costs, say for an inpatient bed, for an outpatient appointment, and the cost of the Henderson itself. And it was a cost offset study. So we looked at what people had reused in the year prior, in the year of, or however long they stayed in the Henderson, and in the year afterwards. And it showed that people were using about 10% of the cost in the year following than they had in the year prior. And that the unit would therefore sort of pay for itself, if you like. The cost of the health service would have been repaid in about 2 years.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because if anything, you think that kind of like cost to society might even have been underestimated in terms of when you think about the impact on children and partners and other people that fall within the world of that individual. You've really kind of, due to necessity, had to stick with quite crude variables, which would have, if anything, kind of diminished the research outcome, I think. So it's fascinating that you got that, that it's such a big saving.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it was very basic in a way, but quite stark. And at that time, with the Henderson being sort of nationally commissioned, it was a useful piece of information to have. It doesn't work so well now, where commissioning is all in subsets, because whose cost is it? Whose gain is it? But you're absolutely right. There are loads of things that you costed, and also at that point there wasn't, certainly, I don't think it was well developed, the idea of health-related quality of life. and cost benefit. So it was just a cost offset. How much did these patients cost a year before they came? How much did it cost for the Henderson to treat them? And how much did they cost in the year after they left? So very simple, but quite stark. But that's because, that unit was taking people who were often bouncing in and out and quite often staying for a very long time in acute psychiatry, which is very expensive. Prison was a bit cheaper. But yes, the high levels of service usage, so costly people.
I was thinking about that earlier question, and I'm not sure I totally got the drift of it, but I was thinking really that back then in the 90s and early noughties, TCs, I'm sure the Henderson, actually I'm sure the Fens, were trauma informed. They were very aware of the kind of influence of early childhood experiences. It was sometimes difficult to do research on those areas because quite often they were discounted as not being relevant, because for our groups in prisons, it was difficult to see how they affected the criminogenic need issue.
Well, I think it's a really good point. I think the TCs were already understanding, these responses as a response to traumatic experience, and learned behaviours from early experience. But the research effort, so looking back at, the Henderson had itself a fight for its survival for its whole existence. And research into the treatment effectiveness for personality disorders, as you say, Naomi, was not very well established. And the larger sort of psychiatric and mental health community weren't convinced by what there was. So there was a lot of therapeutic pessimism at that time. And so when I referred to going out and sort of educating staff in other mental health contexts about the TC, part of that was about trying to engender more therapeutic optimism. So yes, I think it's a very good point to register that is exactly the TC's understanding.
Yeah, I'd agree, but I think particularly with men that's a kind of conversation that even now isn't really all that welcome. So I've presented data on an audit of the traumatic histories of the men in the Fen service, and every time I present it, someone says, "How do you know they're not lying?" And I think if I was presenting data on women, I doubt very much that that's the response I would get. And typically, the men are far more up for discussing their offending than they are for discussing their traumatic histories, and they don't present it as trauma when they first start telling you about it. So, I think there isn't really the receptiveness, or maybe more so now, but there isn't really receptiveness to hearing that a lot of this is about trauma.
Yeah, I wonder if that's some strengths perhaps of the TC, the residential TC, that we had a mixed group, men and women. But also, for example, looking at the group you're talking about, we sometimes had people coming to the Henderson from Grendon, so they'd already had quite a long history of being encouraged to look at their trauma, if you like. So I think we didn't see quite the resistance perhaps in that context. It was still there, but perhaps not, as you're saying, because there was a more, perhaps a sort of more varied group of people in that way. I don't know. I'm thinking off the top of my head, But
well,
I wonder.
I think that reflection on having a mixed gender population is quite interesting, because I think, having worked previously in a mixed sex service, quite often the conversation about trauma was able to be led more by the women in the service who had maybe slightly less to risk by putting their trauma out there than the men felt that they had. There was something perhaps that felt emasculating to talk about your vulnerability in that way. So maybe there was a benefit to those mixed sex services.
Yeah, and I think as well, another benefit is that, which I think is a benefit of the TC in terms of bringing the unconscious to the fore. You can see some of that victim-perpetrator thing being played out as people live together, and then it can be discussed. And often that is between gender, not always, but that might be how it comes to light. Not necessarily always in the same direction.
Okay, so we touched upon that key piece of research relating to cost effectiveness, which has frequently been cited, and yet I suppose, as Michael Brooks and David Wilson suggested, does research ever have the lasting effect that you want to have? They questioned whether it was more important to pay attention to the political and social climate that was around, and that research could be relatively ineffectual. And of course, one might say that the sad demise of the Henderson was a sort of indicator of the validity of that point. Maybe, but
Are you asking me to comment on that? I think it's a confluence of lots of factors. So I think they make a very good point, and I think the leadership at the Henderson did, spend quite a lot of time managing those external relationships. But the context, particularly around the time of the replication of the Henderson. So is it useful for me to just say quickly about that? So the Henderson, as I said earlier, sort of had to fight for its survival for its whole life, really, as had the other TCs, because there weren't many of them and they were a bit weird, and were they supposed to fit in? And Henderson was taking patients from people from all over the country. So in 1998, there was an application to the National Specialist Commissioning Advisory Group to purchase the Henderson centrally. Previously to that, they were working on extra contractual referrals, which was, very messy, bureaucratic. And the response was, well, yes, but only if you make 2 more of them, so you can give proper coverage of the country. So hence then there was the idea that we would replicate this long-standing and evolving institution in 2 other places. And around that time, there were lots of changes in personnel at the Department of Health and in the trust and in commissioners. And so people came in with different attitudes and different approaches and different beliefs. So I like the idea that science can have the last word, but there's always an element of opinion and social construction and etc., isn't there? And it's never possible to do a perfect piece of research. And although the Henderson has been subject to research and open to being researched since its inception before the creation of the NHS, you could still criticize the research. And at that time, research in treatment of personality disorders, particularly borderline, expectations were changing around the possibility of doing randomized controlled trials. So Marsha Linehan had developed dialectical behavior therapy in the States, which is an outpatient treatment, and she'd been very careful to write a manual, so you could say whether clinicians were following the treatment or not. And she'd done randomized controlled trials. So then the question becomes, well, why can't you do that of a TC? And I think the other element of that was that, unfortunately, I think because there was the replication, it engendered some competitiveness in the field of personality disorder, and I think as well in the field of TCs, which ultimately people weren't perhaps all pulling in the same direction.
You say a bit more about that, because it's certainly something I sensed and have sensed since and sensed at the time. But it's sometimes a bit intangible to an outsider.
Well, how do I explain that? I suppose, there were processes involved in the commissioning, and various personnel involved in agreeing research protocols and service, outlines, and some strong views about what should be done. And I think, I'm not sure that it was necessary, but I think there was a sense of threat in the community of personality disorder treatments engendered by the Henderson being replicated. And it sounded like a lot of money at the time. I think the award was £8 million. It's not a lot of money, actually. It looked like TCs, particularly residential ones, and particularly the Henderson, and why the Henderson and not anybody else, was getting a big slice of cake. So that, I think that was definitely one element.
Because there was then a time, a brief period, available cake became much bigger. And I can remember going to one of those meetings in London with people coming from all over the country to talk about how they should develop the PD services. And there actually being a great deal of hostility towards the Henderson in particular and TCs in general.
Yeah, it's kind of reassuring to hear that you witnessed that, because I believe that I witnessed a considerable amount of that, and I'm not really sure why it was necessary. There are, within this patient group that you call personality disorder or severe personality disorder, there's a wide variety of need, and there are lots of people in that group of distressed people, and their needs could be met with different levels of treatment. I do remember being at a big conference on personality disorder, I think funded by the DOH at the time, trying to design a seamless service whereby you would have a coordinated approach to sending the most distressed and difficult to contain group to the residential units, and there'd be something with a similar ethos that they could follow a treatment pathway back out to be then independent and not need so much support ultimately. But that never really happened. I don't think, even with the tiered idea, it didn't. I don't know what you think, David, but I don't think the tiered idea met that brief, which was the conceptualization at this conference, probably in '97 or something like that.
No, I agree. I mean, I can remember working at Millfields, and we were supposed to work at a particular place in the tier, and actually we wanted to do what we wanted to do, the direction we went in.
Well, I think that's also the case, isn't it? So we had the idea, I used the example of Malinahan earlier, where it's apparently so simple and neat. She's got a model, it's written down, you can check whether the clinicians are following the model, and you can subject it to an RCT. And TCs are a little bit more fluid than that, principle driven rather than specific procedure driven. And clinicians like to have their creativity and to follow the individual person's need as well, don't they? And so that was also an element we had to manage in the replication. So one challenge was, how do you take a unit which is predicated on the idea of democracy and has grown itself over 50 years and make the same, dictate the same into other places? There's a kind of contradiction in terms, isn't it? And that was a challenge. So those new places wanted some semblance of their own individuality. And yet from the centre, there was a drive, we want to know that these are Hendersons. And then when there are three of them, we can subject the three of them to an RCT and find out whether it reads. And we never made it to that point.
So, just to move to some extent already, because you were the lead author in the review of treatments for DSBD, which they shortened to personality disorder, I think, in the published report, and you did that for the government. How did that come about, and what impact do you think it had?
I'm probably less well qualified to comment on the latter part of that than you are, but I think how did it come about? There was a tender advertised, and we bid for it. There was a small group of us, primarily based at St George's, with a health economist from Oxford, and we won the contract. It was quite a challenging piece of work. It's a messy area research-wise, but almost in contrast to what we've just said about the difficulty of specifying what the TC is, it was a simpler model in terms of looking at consistent effectiveness research. There was lots of research on small elements of the effectiveness of a particular approach to a particular outcome. But the TCs with the Henderson work and Grendon work and some studies from the US, had a substantial body of evidence, albeit it was all naturalistic and not RCT. But apart from Marshall Linehan's work, which is in borderline patients, predominantly women, in an outpatient setting, there was no level 1 evidence at that time for anything else. Whereas there was a significant amount of evidence for TCs with people in prison settings or with issues that might more closely resemble those who were going to end up in the SPD unit, more closely than the DBT patients would resemble that group. In terms of its influence, I don't know. It seemed to me that the DSPD units and other perhaps forensic units did try to adopt some more principles around empowerment and democracy, which were borrowed from therapeutic communities.
I suppose it lent some momentum to what I think was the sort of prevailing wish within government to produce something to offer treatment to this group of people who otherwise they wanted to lock up to trial. Because in a sense that was the balance that was around, wasn't it? This kind of idea that you could identify people who were going to be very risky and very dangerous, and you could lock them up first.
Yeah. When Bridget Dolan and Jeremy Coyd had done a review in '93, hadn't they, about psychopathic disorders, really arguing that they were treatable. And prior to that, there had been the consignment of that group to an untreatable, prison-only route.
So we all thought we'd got an RCT done. It was a struggle, but Steve Pearce thought he'd done one with his Oxford TC. And then quite recently, a Cochrane review on borderline personality disorder declined to accept it as evidence. They ruled it out on the basis of the abstract, on the grounds that the intervention that you tested is a socio-environmental therapy because it consists of being part of a therapeutic community that is built on democratic principles, consisting of shared decision-making around group matters, discussion of behaviour, feedback on behaviour, shared living, creating a community and activities, etc. Therefore, we regard it as a socio-environmental intervention rather than psychotherapy. So we were all a bit fed up with that because it's a bit puzzling. What do you make of it?
Well, I suppose I make of it, at one level I make of it that it's the same old problem. So, as we were just saying about the replicating Henderson and identifying what is a TC, there are numerous papers in the archives of therapeutic community theory and research questioning what a TC is. It seems like, that trap is all there. So you can't specify exactly what the therapeutic ingredients are, or you can't badge those or identify those with a particular psychotherapeutic intervention and theory. I mean, I wonder, it makes me curious why Cochrane scoped the review in the way that they did. And I don't know if you know any of the background to that.
No, I don't know the background. Seem to differ because there was a previous Cochrane report on another aspect of personality disorder just a year or so before, which had slightly different parameters.
Because if it's about looking at what works for the patient group, I wonder why it's so important that it's psychotherapy, except from the point of view of being able to then roll it out elsewhere. And it's always been an issue. So the Henderson only used group approaches, but the groups were different. There was a psychosocial, environmental aspect, and small group psychotherapy. Community groups were more about democratic decision making with a little bit of reflecting on how you're actually being right now, or how you were yesterday, or how you'll be tomorrow. And the Castle always had individual psychotherapy embedded within their therapeutic community. So there is the idea that there are different things going on, which does present a challenge for then pooling results and making an overall statement. And it really never has been established, or what is the key bit? Not in research terms. So, for example, you could think that mentalization-based therapy, which again, has received a lot of attention in the last decade or so, to what extent is that a renaming of something, of a key element of what happens in a therapeutic community? But we don't know as researchers.
Though they don't claim it to be necessarily doing anything different, do they, to what happens in lots of other therapeutic approaches? And I suppose what often happens is commissioners or, trusts become hooked on the latest buzzword, and mentalisation-based therapy has become one of those popular buzzwords. So people then start looking for something distinctively described as MBT, rather than recognising that the elements of MBT are there also in therapeutic communities, in that sense of understanding how people develop the capacity to mentalise. But just our language is so important.
Or there might be an added advantage. Yeah, or that there might be an added value of the democratic decision making that happens in a therapeutic community and the living alongside over just having mentalisation based therapy. But it's too challenging for research to answer that question in a way that would, give you confidence to know, isn't it?
So, Fiona, you had left the Henderson before 2000. From your perspective as an interested outsider, what's your understanding of what happened? Why did it close, given that it had such a relatively good evidence base?
Well, on the question of why it closed despite the evidence base, I think I touched on some aspects of that already. I think the environment had perhaps turned hostile or moved on to the next best thing, and that there just wasn't enough support to keep it going. I wasn't there, and I can't speak for the people who were there. My sense is that the closure was quite a traumatic and drawn out process for residents and staff, really. Know that a resident, a set of residents continued to meet and to have a group afterwards and to create their own thing. But I think it was very difficult, because I think, the question you're asking is perhaps one we don't have an answer to that makes sense.
Seems quite an impactful loss if the residents were still continuing to meet afterwards to hold on to the remnants of something that had been there, doesn't it?
I think that had started before the closure, to be fair. So they had, some ex-residents had created a sort of, at one stage it was called Emergence. There was a name before that, and they were actually read from a couple of decades ago, initially. And so that wasn't necessarily just associated with the closure, but I think the point of it perhaps is there was maybe a Henderson life that continued for some of the residents, that actually their experience was quite profound. And I mean, you often, if you listen to ex-residents giving presentations, they do talk about it as a life-changing experience. So, yeah, and I think it had a very committed staff team who worked really hard. And I think, it was under attack sounds very dramatic, but, there was a hostility, as David was saying, quite a sustained period. So it is quite sad from that point of view. I think the other thing is, sort of as a researcher, we were talking earlier about the idea of a seamless service, so that the people who needed it most would get residential service, and there would be some sort of continuity of model down to a much less intense approach. And the question for me would be, well, what's happened to that group? If it's indeed the case that those people who would otherwise have gone to the Henderson are now in some other non-residential form of support, and that's fine. well, fine. But we don't know the answer to that, do we?
No, I think it's quite interesting, isn't it, in terms of approaches towards treatment for people with a diagnosis of personality disorder at that time, because obviously the offenders with personality disorder pathway got this huge injection, this amount of money to spend, which I think that came online about 2010. So it's not that far after. And I get that not everyone who would have found themselves living in the Henderson would have a history of offending, but you can see there's some overlap, and I suppose it doesn't seem to make that much sense to demolish or dismantle a set of services that had been working and that had some evidence of efficacy, to then move all this other money to another stream of services, rather than trying to, in the way that Grendon became integrated within the offender personality disorder pathway. You think surely it couldn't have been beyond the wherewithal to have managed to find a way to establish a chain of communication between the Henderson group as well. It seems a shame, after something that had inspired quite a lot of passion and commitment to providing a form of treatment where there were democratic principles, as you say, which actually, now the pathway, I think, really works quite hard to try and catch up with that sense of power sharing, rather than having clinicians sitting in authority over patients. So I can understand why people who are associated with the service, there's that sense of grief that comes with it.
Yeah, I mean, I can only really speak for myself, I suppose. I mean, I have some sense of grief also, because I worked hard, and you can criticize the research in lots of ways, but there was some evidence of effect, and the cost offset suggested that it wasn't perhaps a bad investment, and there was a place for it. And I think there was a cultural element, which is something we can all learn from.
Wonder as well at times whether sometimes people like to start something new, don't they? It's a bit like the making a mistake in your first page of your notebook at the start of the school term and ripping it out so you've got a fresh slate to start on. And you wonder whether sometimes with these huge amounts of money that actually there was a sense of it would be nice to start something fresh and have it all invigorated and appear to be a brand new thing, rather than managing to build and develop on a foundation that perhaps was already there.
Yeah, yes, and I think that individual clinicians probably feel that too. And there definitely was a sense of, well, has the Henderson changed enough? Has it kept up with the times? Because it stood very much on its roots, and they were very deep. It was old, it'd been going for 60 years. And yes, I think that's right.
What would you say were the main things about the Henderson and its approach that really made a difference to patients?
When I read that question, I was thinking that that was quite a big question. I wasn't quite sure how to answer it, but you've asked it in a slightly more focused way. I think that so in the sort of law of it, the democratization and the reality confrontation features that were brought out from some very early theoretical writing about it.
Could you just say something about those principles for people who are listening who might not know much about therapeutic communities?
Yeah, so they're predicated on the idea that decision making, including about the rules of the units, are democratically made. One person, one vote, staff included. Patient group always outnumbers the staff group. So there's genuine power in the resident group. They were called residents of the Henderson. The reality confrontation aspect sort of refers to the idea that through being, you can be shown how you are and who you are. And those there were various attempts to sort of redefine and refine those principles, but I think they were quite enduring for me for what I observed. And when I did the qualitative work with the residents about self-harming, what seemed to emerge was that there was a support to receive the reality confrontation from the fact that you were getting it from other people with similar histories and similar problems. Because selection into the unit was weekly, you had residents who'd been there for longer and new residents, so there was some sort of elder statesperson-ish element to it. So although the others, your peers, were seen to be, like-minded, rather than being told by a staff member who you might think has no idea what you're going through, you're getting feedback from people who you see as more similar, but some of them have been in the unit longer, so have a bit more experience. And that one of the sort of most important things people seem to draw on was the idea that they hadn't quite appreciated how their behaviour impacted on other people. And I think by appreciate, that's not just knowing it intellectually. I think that's a sort of genuine sense of caring, actually, how your behaviour affected other people. And that over time, in relation to self-harming, it just lost its meaning. So it wasn't necessary as a coping mechanism. And I think I said earlier, another element that sort of stood out for me is just that the doing things together, and the residential unit living together and having time that's not structured together as well, allowed people's relationship disturbance to be played out rather than have to be spoken out. And then it could be spoken out and looked at. So I think those would be key features for me.
You're a very modest person, Fiona, and like, I suppose, any good researcher, you describe things without hyperbole and in a very balanced fashion. But I noticed that earlier on you said that you did your growing up there. And it reminded me of how Roland Woodward had said to us that pretty much that he was deconstructed when he went to Grendon and put back together again. And I wondered if you meant something vaguely similar when you said I did my growing up there, because if I think about my growing up, it was fairly turbulent too.
Well, yeah, I suppose my adult growing, I do think I matured. I learned a lot about respect for other people, about boundaries, about communication. I learned a lot, obviously, as well about trauma and distress and healing. But yeah, I think that's. I do feel like I also learned a lot personally just by being in that sort of therapeutic environment, because although I wasn't involved in providing clinical input to the residents, as I say, I observed by being part of the community meetings. And then all the staff meetings were also group meetings, including a weekly reflective practice type group, supervision group, which I also so everyone went to that, admin staff as well. So I attended that too. So through that, I think I learned a lot about people. I don't know everything about people still, but I felt like I did learn a lot about being in a group and in society from being there.
Okay. So finally, we always like to hear from our guests about the things that give them emotional nourishment and support away from work. So what would your things be, Fiona?
I was thinking about that. I was about to be very modest again. I don't think there's anything particularly exciting or interesting about what gives me nourishment to other people, perhaps, but I've always liked escaping into fiction, books. So that's something that I like to do when I get peace and quiet to do it. And this year, perhaps more than usual, I mean, I've always liked to be outdoors, reasonably sporty, but this year more than anything else, I live in London, so seeing green things and wild living things and big skies has, been very much craved for and treasured soul food. And I think, it's been harder to get those things this year. And so they're important just to kind of just notice them more, as has more contact with the closest sort of ring of social and family contacts, because it's been difficult, hasn't it, to be in proper contact with more distal, and lots of people have kind of become quite insular in that respect. So it's been a real source of strength and stability, I think. But it was an atypical year. Yeah. I think it's noticing the small things. I know that sounds a bit mindfulness based, but it is just paying attention to the small bits around the smells and life, nature.
Thank you very much. That's terrific, and it's really nice seeing you again. Seems to have been quite a long time.
Well, and you. I hope I've given you sort of what you needed or what you wanted. I do feel very rusty.